Welcome back to Warm Pages, where we warm hearts with stories as comforting as your morning coffee. I'm your host Harry, and today we're steeping ourselves in the world of Sherlock Holmes. Now tell me, isn't it wonderful how stories bring us together, no matter where we are in this big world? Before we begin, I'd love to know which corner of the world are you enjoying this story from today. I'm reading every single one. Let's get started. Chapter 1. A Peculiar Invitation. It was in the latter part of October, when the trees in London had shed their golden mantle, and a persistent fog had settled upon the city like a shroud, that my friend Sherlock Holmes received one of the most peculiar letters of his illustrious career. The morning had begun drearily enough, with a fine, penetrating rain that seemed to seep through the very walls of our lodgings at Baker Street, creating an atmosphere of melancholy that not even the cheerful crackling of our hearth could dispel. Holmes had been in one of his contemplative moods, barely touching the breakfast that Mrs. Hudson had prepared, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point beyond our rain-streaked windows. I had just unfolded my morning paper, resigning myself to a quiet day indoors, when the bell rang downstairs, and moments later, our landlady appeared with a letter upon a silver tray. "A messenger brought this, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "Said it was most urgent and required your immediate attention." Holmes took the envelope with a languid gesture that belied the sudden sharpening of his gaze. The envelope was of expensive quality, addressed in a firm, educated hand, with a distinctive wax seal bearing the emblem of a raven. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, examining the seal before breaking it. "The paper is from Northumberland. Observe the watermark, Watson, and our correspondent is a man of considerable means but currently experiencing some nervous agitation. Note the slight tremor in the downstrokes." "Really, Holmes," I said with a smile, for I had long since ceased to be amazed at his powers of observation, though they never failed to impress me. "And I suppose you can tell his profession as well?" "Industrial manufacturing, I should say," Holmes replied, unfolding the letter. "There are minute traces of metallic dust embedded in the paper, consistent with proximity to ironworks." He fell silent as his eyes darted across the page, and I watched as his expression transformed from mild curiosity to intense interest. His thin lips pressed together, and he sat forward in his chair. All lethargy vanished in an instant. "Watson," he said at last, passing the letter to me, "it appears we may have an opportunity to escape this dismal London weather. Read this, if you would." The letter read as follows: "Blackwood Manor, Northumberland, the 23rd of October, 1887. Sherlock Holmes, sir, I find myself in a position of extreme distress and unusual circumstance, which I believe may benefit from your renowned powers of analytical reasoning. My name is Edward Blackwood, proprietor of the Blackwood Iron and Steel Works, and I reside at my ancestral home in Northumberland. During recent renovations to the east wing of the manor, workmen discovered an ancient iron door in what appears to be a previously unknown cellar chamber. This door, bearing peculiar markings unlike anything I have encountered, has resisted all conventional attempts to open it. More disturbing still, strange sounds emanate from behind this barrier during the night hours, sounds that defy rational explanation. I would dismiss these occurrences as mere fancy, were it not for the disappearance of 3 workmen who attempted to breach the door. Each man vanished without trace over the course of a fortnight, leaving behind nothing but their tools placed in curious arrangements before the door. The local population speaks of an ancient curse upon my family line, but I am a man of science, Mr. Holmes, not given to superstition. Nevertheless, I have begun to receive threatening notes warning me to leave the past sealed, and I fear for my safety and that of my household. I can offer generous compensation for your services, and shall prepare accommodations for both yourself and Dr. Watson, should he wish to accompany you. The matter is of the utmost urgency. Your obedient servant, Edward Blackwood." "Well, what do you make of it?" Holmes asked as I finished reading, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark that always presaged an interesting case. "It sounds rather fantastical," I admitted, returning the letter. Though I suspect there is a perfectly rational explanation. Precisely my thinking, Watson. The rational explanation, however, may prove more interesting than any supernatural alternative. 3 disappearances, mysterious warnings and an impenetrable door. It presents a most stimulating problem. Holmes rose from his chair and paced before the fire, his dressing gown billowing behind him. Telegraph your patients that you will be unavailable for a few days. The 11:40 train to Newcastle should serve our purposes admirably. You mean to accept the case, then? Indeed, there is something in Mr. Blackwood's account that suggests matters of considerable gravity. Holmes paused by the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street. And I fancy we are already involved more deeply than we know. What makes you say that? I asked, puzzled by his remark. Holmes gestured towards the street below. The messenger who delivered this letter has been loitering across the street for precisely 17 minutes, occasionally glancing up at our windows. He is not dressed as a common messenger, and he has twice checked his pocket watch with the nervous gesture of a man under instruction to report the exact time of delivery and our reaction. I joined Holmes at the window and observed a tall figure in a dark coat standing beneath a street lamp, his features obscured by the brim of his hat and the swirling fog. "We are being watched, Watson," Holmes continued softly. "The game is already afoot, and I suspect this is merely the opening move in a complex stratagem. As we prepared for our journey northward that afternoon, I could not shake the feeling that we were embarking upon one of the strangest adventures of our shared career. The rain intensified as our hansom cab carried us to King's Cross Station, and not once did I notice the dark figure who followed discreetly behind, maintaining a careful distance through the crowded London streets. Chapter 2. The Blackwood Estate. Our journey northward proved uneventful, though Holmes maintained a vigilant observation throughout, occasionally instructing me to glance casually behind us to determine whether we were still being followed. The pleasant countryside of autumn England gave way to more rugged terrain as we ventured deeper into Northumberland, with its ancient stone walls cutting across windswept moors like the scars of bygone ages. "I have taken the liberty of researching our host, Watson," Holmes remarked as we sat in our private compartment, the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels providing a steady backdrop to his words. "Edward Blackwood inherited his father's modest ironworks some 15 years ago and transformed it into one of the most prosperous industrial concerns in the North. A man of considerable scientific education, Cambridge if I'm not mistaken, and reputed to be something of a recluse despite his commercial success. A recluse with a fiancée," I noted, recalling a detail from my perusal of the society pages some weeks earlier. Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Indeed, that information was not readily available in my sources. Miss Helena Prescott," I supplied. "The announcement was made last month. Her family is old Northumberland gentry, I believe, though not particularly wealthy in recent generations." "Excellent, Watson. Your appetite for society gossip proves useful once again." Holmes's thin lips curved in the ghost of a smile. The connection between ancient lineage and newfound industrial wealth, a common enough arrangement in our modern age. As the day waned, we arrived at a small rural station where a carriage bearing the Blackwood crest awaited us. The driver, a taciturn fellow with weather-beaten features, nodded curtly at Holmes's introduction and secured our luggage with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you, gentlemen," he said gruffly. "It's a good 7 miles to the estate, and the roads are poor after the recent rains." The journey proved as challenging as foretold. Our carriage lurched along narrow country lanes bordered by ancient stone walls and gnarled trees whose twisted branches seemed to claw at the darkening sky. As we crested a final hill, Blackwood Manor came into view, a formidable edifice of grey stone, parts of which appeared to date from medieval times, while others reflected more recent architectural sensibilities. Light gleamed from several windows, providing the only warmth in an otherwise forbidding aspect. "Rather imposing, wouldn't you say?" I remarked. Holmes nodded, his keen eyes scanning the structure. The east wing appears considerably older than the rest, Norman foundations if I'm not mistaken. Curious that renovations should uncover a previously unknown cellar in such an extensively inhabited dwelling. The carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel sweep before the main entrance, and we had scarcely alighted when the heavy oak door swung open to reveal a slender man of middle years, whose aquiline features and nervous demeanor immediately marked him as our correspondent. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank God you've come," Edward Blackwood exclaimed, advancing to greet us with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. His handshake was firm but tremulous, and I noted the dark circles beneath his intelligent eyes. "Please, come in out of this abominable weather. Mrs. Crawford has prepared rooms for you, and dinner awaits whenever you are refreshed." The interior of Blackwood Manor presented a stark contrast to its exterior severity. The entrance hall was handsomely appointed, with polished oak paneling and a magnificent staircase that curved upward to the gallery above. Modern gas lamps provided ample illumination, and a large fire blazed in the hearth, dispelling the chill of the October evening. "You mentioned in your letter that you have been receiving threatening notes, Mr. Blackwood," Holmes said without preamble as our host directed us toward the staircase. "I should like to examine them at your earliest convenience." Blackwood's face paled slightly. "Yes, of course, I have preserved them as you might expect. But first, allow me to introduce you to the household." As if on cue, a door opened from what I presume to be the drawing room, and a striking woman of perhaps 25 years emerged. She was tall and elegant, with auburn hair arranged in the latest fashion and remarkable green eyes that assessed us with undisguised curiosity. "Helena, my dear," Blackwood said, his voice softening. "May I present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and his associate Dr. Watson. Gentlemen, my fiancée, Miss Helena Prescott." Miss Prescott offered her hand with a gracious smile. "I have heard much about your remarkable abilities, Mr. Holmes." Edward has been beside himself with worry these past weeks. "I do hope you can bring some rationality to this unsettling business." "I shall certainly endeavor to do so, Miss Prescott," Holmes replied with a slight bow. I noticed his penetrating gaze taking in every detail of her appearance and demeanor. "Helena has been my strength through this ordeal," Blackwood said, placing his hand affectionately upon hers, "though I confess her fascination with the iron door somewhat exceeds my own." "It is not fascination, Edward, but concern," she corrected gently. "The historical significance alone." She was interrupted by the arrival of a portly, middle-aged gentleman with mutton-chop whiskers and the unmistakable bearing of a medical man. "Ah, there you are, Helena. I was wondering where you had disappeared to." "My cousin, Dr. James Harrington," Miss Prescott explained to us. "He serves as our family physician and has been kind enough to stay at the manor since these disturbances began." Dr. Harrington shook our hands vigorously. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, gentlemen, though I must say I think Edward has brought you here on a fool's errand. Ancient doorways and village superstitions, hardly worthy of your considerable talents, Mr. Holmes. I find that even the most seemingly trivial matters can conceal complexities of surprising depth, Dr. Harrington." Holmes replied evenly. "The disappearance of 3 men is hardly a trivial matter in any case." "Runaways, more likely than not," Harrington said dismissively. "The working classes are notoriously unreliable, particularly when local gossip inflames their natural superstitions." I observed a flash of annoyance cross Blackwood's features at this remark, quickly suppressed. "Perhaps you might show our guests to their rooms, Helena," he suggested. "Mrs. Crawford has prepared the chambers in the west wing, well away from the disturbances." As if summoned by her name, an elderly woman appeared from what I took to be the servants' passage, tall, spare, with iron-grey hair, and a face as unyielding as the manor's stone walls. She regarded us with unconcealed suspicion. "Mrs. Crawford, our housekeeper," Blackwood explained. She has been with the Blackwood family for 3 generations, and never known such goings-on, the woman said grimly. Begging your pardon, sir, but no good will come of disturbing what's meant to stay hidden. Some doors are closed for a purpose. Mrs. Crawford, please, Blackwood said with evident embarrassment. Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson are our guests. The housekeeper pressed her lips into a thin line but nodded stiffly before turning to lead us upstairs. As we followed, I noticed a thin, scholarly-looking man hovering at the edge of the gathering, watching the proceedings with an intensity that seemed at odds with his subservient position. My secretary, Thomas Barrett, Blackwood explained, noticing my glance. A most capable assistant, though he has been somewhat distracted of late. Barrett, please ensure that my study is prepared for our consultation after dinner. The secretary nodded silently, his pale features betraying no emotion, though I could not help but notice a curious tremor in his right hand as he withdrew. Our chambers proved comfortable, if somewhat austere, and after a brief interval to refresh ourselves, we joined the household for dinner. The conversation remained stubbornly fixed on inconsequential matters, despite Holmes's occasional attempts to direct it toward the mystery at hand. It was only when we retired to Blackwood's study, a handsome room lined with scientific texts and engineering journals, that our host finally broached the subject that had brought us to Northumberland. I must apologize for my household's reticence, Mr. Holmes, he said, pouring brandies for the 3 of us. The events of recent weeks have affected us all in different ways. Now, as to these threatening notes, he withdrew a small folder from his desk drawer and handed it to Holmes, who examined the contents with focused attention. I glimpsed several slips of paper, each bearing a message composed of letters apparently cut from newspapers. The silence was shattered by a piercing scream from somewhere below us, a cry of such terror that it froze the blood in my veins. Blackwood leapt to his feet, his face ashen. "It comes from the cellar," he whispered. "Dear God, it has begun again." Chapter 3. Ancient Histories. We followed Blackwood at a run, descending first the main staircase, and then a narrower stone-cut flight that spiraled into the depths of the manor. Gas lamps had been installed even here, though they cast more shadows than light upon the ancient stonework. The air grew perceptibly colder as we descended, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and something else, a metallic tang that seemed strangely out of place. Another cry, weaker than the first but no less chilling, guided us through a low-ceilinged passage to a heavy wooden door. Blackwood thrust it open to reveal a spacious cellar, well ordered with wine racks along one wall and various household stores arranged neatly upon shelves. At the far end, a section of relatively new brickwork had been partially dismantled, revealing an opening to a further chamber beyond. Barrett, the secretary, was slumped against this opening, his face ghastly pale in the lamplight, his eyes wide with terror. Dr. Harrington was already kneeling beside him, while Miss Prescott stood nearby, her expression a curious mixture of concern and something else I could not immediately identify. Mrs. Crawford hovered at the entrance to the cellar, making the sign of the cross repeatedly and muttering what sounded like an ancient prayer. "He says he saw something emerge from the iron door," Harrington explained as we approached, his clinical detachment at odds with the palpable tension in the air, though as you can see for yourselves, the door remains sealed. Holmes strode forward, surveying the scene with his characteristic methodical attention. The opening in the brickwork led to a small antechamber hewn from the bedrock itself, at the back of which stood the iron door that had featured so prominently in Blackwood's letter. It was smaller than I had imagined, perhaps 5 feet in height, and constructed of what appeared to be solid iron plates riveted together with extraordinary craftsmanship. The surface was indeed covered with markings, concentric circles intersected by straight lines, forming patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. "Most unusual," Holmes murmured, running his fingers lightly over the symbols. "These markings predate the house itself by several centuries, I should say. Observe the oxidation patterns, Watson," consistent with great age, yet the metal itself shows remarkable resistance to corrosion. It's impossible, Barrett gasped from where he sat, accepting a glass of brandy from Blackwood with trembling hands. I saw it open just a crack. A figure emerged, not human, and then the door sealed itself again. I swear it on my life. Come, man, pull yourself together, Harrington said brusquely. You've been working too hard, that's all. These past weeks have been trying for everyone. Holmes knelt to examine the floor before the door, his lens in hand. The dust pattern is most informative, he remarked, more to himself than to us. Mr. Barrett, has anyone approached the door today prior to your experience? The secretary shook his head. No, sir. Mr. Blackwood forbade it after the disappearances. And yet there are fresh marks here, Holmes continued, pointing to faint disturbances in the dust. Someone has been here within the past 12 hours, standing precisely where I am now. All eyes turned to Barrett, who flushed. It wasn't me. I came down only because I thought I heard my name being called from behind the door. Perhaps we should continue this discussion upstairs, Blackwood suggested, glancing uneasily at the iron door. The hour grows late, and Mr. Barrett clearly requires rest. With Harrington's assistance, Barrett was escorted upstairs, followed by Mrs. Crawford, who refused to look back at the iron door. As the others departed, I noticed Miss Prescott lingering, her gaze fixed upon the ancient barrier, with an intensity that seemed at odds with her earlier composure. You find it fascinating rather than frightening, Holmes observed quietly. She started slightly, as though unaware we had remained. Yes, she admitted. The craftsmanship alone is remarkable, but the symbols, they suggest a knowledge far beyond what one would expect from medieval metallurgists. You are familiar with metallurgical history, Miss Prescott. A slight flush colored her cheeks. My family has always had an interest in such matters. The Prescotts were patrons of alchemists in centuries past, a foolish pursuit, no doubt, but it has left us with a certain appreciation for ancient crafts. Helena, Blackwood called from the top of the cellar steps. Are you coming? Yes, Edward, of course. She cast one last glance at the door before departing, leaving Holmes and myself alone in the chamber. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? He asked, continuing his examination of the door. Barrett clearly experienced something traumatic, I replied, though whether it was real or imagined remains to be seen. The door itself is certainly unusual, but I see no evidence that it has been opened recently. Precisely. No mechanism is apparent, yet someone wishes us to believe it can open, or at the very least, that something can pass through it. Holmes tapped his fingers against the metal, listening carefully to the resulting sound. Solid throughout, with no hollow spaces. Most curious. He stepped back, surveying the entire chamber with narrowed eyes. Tomorrow, Watson, I believe we must make inquiries in the village. The local perspective on this manor and its history may prove illuminating. Our investigations the following morning began at the Blackwood Arms, the village's sole public house, where Holmes's discreet inquiries soon directed us to the home of Marcus Gillespie, the local historian and custodian of parish records. We found him in a cottage overlooking the village green, surrounded by stacks of documents and leather-bound volumes, a small, wizened man with bright eyes, magnified by spectacles of considerable thickness. Blackwood Manor? He repeated, after Holmes had explained our interest. Oh, aye. There's history there, right enough. Not built by Blackwoods at all. Originally, the land belonged to Northchester Abbey, until Henry VIII's dissolution. The first manor was constructed using stones from the old monastery. Desecration, some called it. And was there anything unusual about the monastery? Holmes inquired, accepting a cup of strong tea from our host. Gillespie chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves rustling. Depends what you mean by unusual, sir. Northchester wasn't like other Benedictine houses, had a reputation for strange studies, what we'd call scientific today, but back then walked a fine line with heresy. The last abbot, Ambrose, was rumored to have discovered secrets of transmutation, alchemy, I said, with a skeptical smile. Aye, doctor, though they didn't call it such. Natural philosophy was their term. When the abbey was seized, Abbot Ambrose disappeared, along with his most precious manuscripts. Gillespie leaned forward conspiratorially. Local legend says he sealed himself in a secret chamber beneath the abbey, taking his knowledge to the grave rather than surrendering it to the crown. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. And this chamber, has anyone ever claimed to have found it? Not that I know of, sir, though there's always been talk of strange noises from beneath the old east wing, where they say the abbey's chapter house once stood. The Blackwoods aren't the first owners to report disturbances. The Prescott family owned it for generations before losing it to gambling debts in the last century. The Prescotts, I interjected, recalling Miss Helena's comments about her family's alchemical interests. Old family, fallen on hard times. Miss Helena's the last of them now. Quite the coincidence her engagement to Blackwood brings the estate full circle, as it were. Holmes and I exchanged a significant glance before taking our leave of the historian, armed with several ancient maps and parish chronicles he had generously offered to loan us. My own investigations that afternoon took me to the homes of the 3 missing workmen, situated in a row of neat cottages on the village outskirts. At each I encountered a similar story. The men had indeed received substantial sums before their disappearance, ostensibly as advance payment for future work at the manor. Their families, while concerned by the sudden departures, seemed remarkably unconcerned about their ultimate fate. Jack said there might be work away for a time, the wife of the last missing man told me, a sturdy woman with calloused hands and shrewd eyes. Blackwood had paid him handsome to keep quiet about something they'd found, and there might be more work of a special nature. I didn't ask questions, sir. The money was enough to see us through winter, and then some. By the time I returned to the manor, dusk was settling over the moors, bringing with it a mist that curled around the ancient stones like spectral fingers. I found Holmes in intense conversation with Blackwood in the library, a magnificent room with a vaulted ceiling and shelves reaching from floor to rafters. Their discussion broke off abruptly at my entrance, and I sensed a tension between them that had not existed the previous evening. Holmes's expression was inscrutable, but Blackwood appeared agitated, running his fingers repeatedly through his hair in a nervous gesture. "Ah, Watson, there you are. I was just discussing with our host the curious coincidence of his engagement to the last descendant of the manor's original owners." "Hardly a coincidence, Mr. Holmes," Blackwood replied stiffly. "Helena and I move in the same social circles. Our acquaintance was natural enough." "Indeed, and yet you failed to mention this historical connection in your letter, despite its potential relevance to your current predicament." Before Blackwood could respond, raised voices reached us from the drawing room. Miss Prescott and someone else engaged in heated argument. The door burst open to reveal the lady herself, her cheeks flushed with anger, followed by an equally agitated Dr. Harrington. "Edward, I insist that you reconsider," she declared, barely acknowledging our presence. "To sell the estate now after all we've discussed." "Helena, please, this is hardly the time," Blackwood interrupted, casting an embarrassed glance in our direction. "On the contrary, it seems precisely the time," she countered. "Dr. Harrington informs me you have already contacted solicitors in London." The tension in the room was palpable, broken only by Mrs. Crawford's announcement that dinner was served. The meal passed in uncomfortable silence, and I retired early, leaving Holmes engrossed in the parish records we had borrowed. I was awakened sometime after midnight by a soft knock at my door. Holmes stood there, a finger to his lips, a dark lantern in his hand casting just enough light to reveal his keen, alert expression. "Dress quickly, Watson, and bring your revolver. I believe I have discovered something of significance." Minutes later, we were back in the library, where Holmes led me to a section of shelving filled with ancient leather-bound tomes. "Observe," he whispered, pulling one particular volume halfway out. With a soft click, a portion of the shelving swung inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. "A secret passage," I exclaimed softly. Indeed, and recently used. Note the disturbed dust on the floor. It leads, unless I am greatly mistaken, to a network of tunnels beneath the house, tunnels that may provide access to the chamber behind the iron door without necessitating its opening. We entered cautiously, Holmes leading the way with the shuttered lantern, providing just enough illumination to avoid pitfalls. The passage descended steeply, the air growing noticeably colder and damper as we proceeded. After several minutes of careful progress, we emerged into a broader tunnel hewn from the living rock, its walls glistening with moisture. Roman work, if I'm not mistaken, Holmes murmured, examining the construction. Later expanded during the monastic period. Ah, and here we have evidence of our mysterious activities. He directed the beam of his lantern toward a section of the tunnel floor where clear footprints were visible in the damp earth. Not one set, but several, leading in both directions. Someone has been using this passage regularly, I whispered. Precisely, Watson, and I suspect we are about to discover what lies at its terminus. We followed the footprints for perhaps 200 yards, the tunnel curving gently before ending at a small wooden door, considerably newer than its surroundings. Holmes examined it carefully before attempting to open it, but found it securely locked. Not unexpected, he muttered, before kneeling to inspect the keyhole. A simple enough mechanism, if you would be so kind as to provide some additional light, Watson. From his pocket, he produced the slender tools I had seen him use on previous occasions. Within moments the lock yielded with a soft click, and the door swung inward to reveal a small chamber, fitted as a crude laboratory. Glass vessels and curious instruments crowded a central table, while shelves along the walls held dozens of leather-bound manuscripts, their ancient pages covered with diagrams and spidery writing. Most illuminating, Holmes said, examining the materials with careful attention. These are copies of alchemical texts, medieval in origin but transcribed more recently. Someone has been studying these ancient arts with considerable dedication. A sudden rumble interrupted his analysis, a deep, ominous sound that seemed to come from all around us. Dust sifted from the ceiling, and the lantern flame flickered wildly. "The tunnel is collapsing!" I cried as larger fragments began to fall. Holmes seized several of the manuscripts and thrust them into his coat. "Back, Watson, quickly!" We fled the chamber as the rumbling intensified. Behind us I heard the crash of collapsing stonework as the laboratory was buried beneath tons of rock. We raced through the tunnel, dodging falling debris, the dust thick in our lungs, until at last we reached the relative safety of the passage leading up to the library. Gasping for breath, we emerged into the library to find it empty and undisturbed. Holmes secured the hidden door and led me to a pair of chairs before the dying fire. "A trap, Holmes?" I asked when I had recovered my breath. "Perhaps, though not necessarily sprung intentionally. These tunnels are ancient and unstable. However, the timing is suggestive. Someone knows we have discovered their secret, Watson, and I suspect they will move quickly now to protect whatever lies behind that iron door." Chapter 4. The Vanishing Industrialist. Holmes was unusually reticent the following morning, refusing to discuss our nocturnal adventure over breakfast, despite my pointed inquiries. He had secreted away the manuscripts recovered from the underground laboratory and spent the early hours examining them in the privacy of his chamber. "Patience, Watson," he counseled as we sat in the breakfast room, the weak autumn sunlight barely penetrating the fog that had settled over Blackwood Manor. "There are aspects of this case that remain decidedly unclear. I require more data before formulating a definitive theory." "Mr. Blackwood has not yet joined us," I observed, noting our host's absence. Mrs. Crawford, who was supervising the serving of breakfast, sniffed disapprovingly. "The master often works late in his study, Dr. Watson. I expect he's still abed." "And Miss Prescott?" Holmes inquired casually, buttering a piece of toast. "Gone out riding at first light, sir. The lady is an accomplished horsewoman, and finds the morning air invigorating, regardless of the weather." We were joined shortly thereafter by Dr. Harrington, who appeared somewhat haggard, as though he had slept poorly, he acknowledged us with a curt nod before pouring himself a cup of strong tea. "I trust Barrett is recovered from his fright?" Holmes asked. Harrington grunted. "Well enough. I prescribed a mild sedative. The man has a nervous disposition, exacerbated by overwork and an imagination too readily inflamed by local superstitions. You remain convinced there is a rational explanation for the disturbances?" "Of course," Harrington replied sharply. "I am a man of science, Mr. Holmes, as are you. Surely you don't entertain these Gothic fantasies of spectral manifestations and ancient curses?" "I entertain only the evidence before me," Holmes replied evenly. "Speaking of which, I should like to examine the iron door again in daylight, if you would be so kind as to accompany us, Doctor." Harrington hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, though I assure you, you'll find nothing that wasn't apparent last night." After breakfast, we descended once more to the cellar, where the iron door stood just as we had left it, impassive and unyielding in the harsh light of the gas lamps. Holmes subjected it to a thorough examination, paying particular attention to the mysterious symbols etched into its surface. "These markings," he mused, tracing them with his fingertip. "They appear decorative at first glance, but observe the mathematical precision of their arrangement, Watson. They form a complex pattern that suggests a purpose beyond mere ornamentation." "What sort of purpose?" I asked. "That, my dear fellow, is the heart of our mystery." He turned to Dr. Harrington. "You mentioned that Mr. Blackwood's business has been prosperous. Has that always been the case?" The question seemed to catch Harrington off guard. "I believe so." Edward transformed his father's modest enterprise into a significant concern. "And yet," Holmes persisted, "I notice certain signs of financial strain. The staff is minimal for an estate of this size. Repairs to the West Wing have been postponed, and Mr. Blackwood's pocket watch, though of excellent quality, has been recently pawned and redeemed. Observe the fresh scratches around the case where the pawnbroker's marks were incompletely removed." Harrington's expression hardened. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes?" "Merely gathering facts, Doctor. A man's financial circumstances often provide insight into his motivations." Our conversation was interrupted by rapid footsteps on the cellar stairs. Barrett appeared, his face pale with agitation. "Dr. Harrington." "Gentlemen, Mr. Blackwood cannot be found." "What do you mean, cannot be found?" Harrington demanded. "He is not in his chambers nor in his study. Mrs. Crawford has searched the entire house. His bed has not been slept in, and his morning clothes remain laid out, untouched." Holmes's expression sharpened with interest. "When was he last seen?" "Last evening, sir, after dinner. He mentioned working late in his study, but when I brought his customary nightcap at 11, the room was empty, and no one thought to check on him until now." I asked incredulously. Barrett flushed. "As Mrs. Crawford said, the master often works late. It's not unusual for him to breakfast in his study, or even to forego the meal entirely when absorbed in his calculations." Holmes was already moving toward the stairs. "A thorough search of the grounds is in order, gentlemen. Watson, perhaps you would be good enough to inform Miss Prescott when she returns from her ride." The ensuing hours were dedicated to a methodical examination of the estate. The gardens, outbuildings, and surrounding woodland were combed by servants hastily pressed into service. Holmes, meanwhile, conducted his own search with characteristic thoroughness, paying particular attention to the study where Blackwood had last been seen. I was assigned the task of breaking the news to Miss Prescott, who returned from her ride as the search was fully underway. Her reaction was not what I had anticipated. Concern, certainly, but tempered with a curious restraint that struck me as odd under the circumstances. "Edward has been under considerable strain," she remarked, removing her riding gloves with deliberate care. "Perhaps he simply needed solitude to gather his thoughts, without informing the household of his intentions." I pressed. "Without taking his coat or hat, despite the inclement weather, A flicker of genuine worry crossed her features then. "No, that is unlike him. Edward is meticulously considerate in such matters." By midday, the search had yielded nothing, and Holmes suggested we reconvene in Blackwood's study to review what was known. As we gathered there, Holmes, myself, Dr. Harrington, Miss Prescott, and Barrett, I could not help but notice the subtle currents of tension among our company. Harrington appeared increasingly agitated, while Miss Prescott maintained a composure that seemed almost unnatural under the circumstances. Blackwood's disappearance must be connected to the phenomena surrounding the iron door," Holmes declared without preamble. "The timing is too coincidental to be otherwise." "The door remains sealed," Barrett pointed out. "If Mr. Blackwood encountered whatever I saw, surely we would have heard something." "Not necessarily," Holmes replied. "Our investigations have revealed the existence of passageways beneath the manor, passageways that might provide access to the chamber beyond the iron door without necessitating its opening." Miss Prescott's head snapped up. "What passageways?" "Ancient tunnels predating the current structure, accessible via a concealed entrance in this very library. Dr. Watson and I explored a portion of them last night, discovering evidence that someone has been using them regularly." "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" Harrington demanded. "I was awaiting further evidence before presenting my findings," Holmes replied coolly. "Which brings us to our next step. I suggest we return to the cellar for a more comprehensive examination." The suggestion was met with reluctant agreement, and we descended once more to the chamber containing the iron door. As we approached, Holmes suddenly stopped, his keen eyes fixed on the floor. "Look there," he said quietly, pointing to a dark object lying in the dust before the door. That was not present during our earlier inspection. It was Blackwood's pocket watch, the gold case gleaming dully in the lamplight, the chain broken as though it had been torn from his waistcoat with considerable force. Beside it lay a man's coat, crumpled and stained with what appeared to be soil from the tunnels we had explored. Miss Prescott gasped, her composure finally breaking. "Edward, what has happened to him?" Holmes knelt to examine the items without touching them. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "Observe, Watson, the watch has stopped at precisely 3:17, presumably this morning. The coat bears traces of the same distinctive clay we encountered in the tunnel before its collapse. Are you suggesting Blackwood was in that tunnel when it collapsed?" I asked, horrified at the implication. "It is one possibility among several," Holmes replied, straightening, "though it does not explain how these items came to be placed here, before a door that ostensibly cannot be opened." Harrington cleared his throat. "I think we must consider a more prosaic explanation, gentlemen. Edward Blackwood is facing financial ruin." "What?" Miss Prescott turned to him in shock. "I'm sorry, Helena, but it's true. The Blackwood Iron Works has been hemorrhaging money for months. Several major contracts have been lost, and there are rumors of embezzlement." Harrington's face was grim. "Edward confided in me last week that bankruptcy was imminent unless he could secure a substantial infusion of capital." "So you suggest he has fled his responsibilities?" Holmes asked, his tone neutral. "It would not be unprecedented. The pressure of maintaining this estate, the failing business, the recent disturbances, it might well have overwhelmed a man already predisposed to nervous anxiety. But to leave without a word, without funds or preparations," I objected. "Perhaps not without preparations," Harrington countered. "The missing workmen, each paid handsomely before disappearing, could they not have been establishing a refuge for their employer?" Holmes's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts as he listened to this theory. "An interesting hypothesis, Dr. Harrington, though it fails to account for several salient details. Miss Prescott, were you aware of your fiancé's financial difficulties?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the pocket watch lying in the dust. Not the full extent of them, no. Edward mentioned certain challenges, but assured me they were temporary. He spoke of a discovery that would transform our fortunes." A discovery? Of what nature? He wouldn't say precisely, only that it related to the history of the estate and was of immeasurable value. Her voice faltered. I thought it merely a way to distract me from his obvious concerns, but now I wonder. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. I should like to examine Mr. Blackwood's correspondence with your permission. It may shed light on his state of mind and intentions. Chapter 5. The Secret of the Prescotts. The remainder of that day was spent in a minute examination of Blackwood's papers. Holmes sequestered himself in the study, emerging only occasionally to request specific documents or to pose a seemingly unrelated question to various members of the household. I assisted as best I could, though the technical nature of many of the industrialist's notes filled with metallurgical formulae and engineering calculations lay well beyond my medical expertise. "What do you make of it all, Holmes?" I inquired as evening approached, the weak daylight fading into a gloomy dusk that seemed to mirror the somber mood pervading the manor. My friend was seated at Blackwood's desk, surrounded by stacks of correspondence, ledgers, and notebooks. His keen eyes, sharpened by the intensity of his concentration, moved rapidly over a document covered in what appeared to be some form of cipher. "Several points of extreme interest have emerged, Watson," he replied without looking up. "First, Blackwood's financial difficulties are indeed severe, more so than even Dr. Harrington indicated. The ironworks is not merely failing, it has been systematically looted by someone with intimate knowledge of its operations." "Embezzlement," as Harrington suggested. "Precisely, though the culprit remains unclear. Second, Blackwood has been corresponding extensively with a party whose identity he takes great pains to conceal. These letters," he gestured to several sheets covered in the curious cipher, "contain repeated references to an inheritance of incalculable worth and knowledge that will transform the modern age. The language suggests something far more significant than mere buried treasure. And third," he continued, his voice dropping to ensure we would not be overheard, "I have uncovered a most curious historical fact. The Prescott family were not merely previous owners of this estate, they were its original builders, predating even the monastery that Gillespie mentioned." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. Miss Prescott gave no indication of such deep historical ties. "Indeed, the connection was deliberately obscured generations ago, for reasons that become clear when one examines the family history." Holmes selected a leather-bound volume from among the papers, an ancient genealogical record, its pages yellowed with age. "The Prescotts were accused of witchcraft in the early 16th century. The last acknowledged Prescott owner, Elias, was said to possess unnatural knowledge and to conduct experiments contrary to God's will in chambers beneath the estate." "Alchemy," I murmured, recalling our earlier conversation with Gillespie. "Something more sophisticated, I suspect." The accusations of witchcraft provided a convenient explanation for phenomena that the locals could not otherwise comprehend. The family estates were seized, and the Prescott name fell into obscurity until, by a circuitous route, the property came into Blackwood's possession. "And now Miss Prescott stands to reclaim her ancestral home through marriage," I observed. "Precisely. A convenient arrangement for both parties. Blackwood gains an injection of social standing, while Miss Prescott recovers her heritage." Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the desk. "But there is something more at stake here, Watson. Something valuable enough to justify murder." My blood chilled at his words. "You believe Blackwood has been murdered, then?" "It is one possibility among several, though I reserve judgment until we have more conclusive evidence. What I can state with certainty is that someone in this household is engaged in a complex deception." A soft knock at the study door interrupted our conversation. It was Helena Prescott, her face pale but composed. "Forgive the intrusion, gentlemen, but I wondered if you had made any progress." Holmes regarded her with a measuring gaze. "Some, Miss Prescott. Tell me, why did you not mention that this estate was originally built by your family?" If she was surprised by his direct approach, she concealed it well. After a moment's hesitation, she closed the door behind her and faced us with quiet dignity. The connection is not one that most Prescotts have been eager to acknowledge, Mr. Holmes. The taint of witchcraft accusations, however unjust, has shadowed our family for centuries, and yet you sought to reclaim the property through marriage. I did not seek out Edward for his estate, if that is what you imply, she replied with a flash of genuine indignation. Our attachment is sincere. That the manor would return to Prescott ownership was a poetic justice that pleased us both. Nothing more. What can you tell me of your ancestor, Elias Prescott? Holmes continued, his tone softening slightly. A look of surprise crossed her features. You've been thorough in your research, Mr. Holmes. Elias is something of a family legend, a natural philosopher centuries ahead of his time, persecuted for knowledge that threatened the established order. Family tradition holds that he created a repository of his discoveries somewhere on the estate, though generations of Prescotts have searched for it without success. Until now, perhaps. Miss Prescott's composure faltered momentarily. What do you mean? I suggest, Miss Prescott, that Edward Blackwood discovered this repository, or at least evidence of its existence, during the renovations that uncovered the iron door. His correspondence alludes to scientific knowledge of immense value, and his disappearance coincides with this discovery. She sank into a chair, the color draining from her face. Edward said nothing to me of such a discovery, only that he had found something that might resolve our difficulties. Her voice trembled slightly. If what you suggest is true, where is he now? What has happened to him? Before Holmes could respond, the door burst open to admit Barrett, his normally neat appearance in disarray. Inspector Carlton of Scotland Yard has arrived, sir, he announced breathlessly. He insists on speaking with you immediately. Inspector Carlton proved to be a solid, square-faced man of middle years, with the weary eyes of one who has seen too much of humanity's darker nature. He greeted Holmes with gruff respect, tinged with professional wariness. Mr. Holmes, I might have known you'd be involved in this business. We've had reports from London about Blackwood's financial irregularities for months. When word reached us of his disappearance, I was dispatched to investigate. You believe he has fled to avoid prosecution? Holmes inquired mildly. It's the most likely explanation. The man's been systematically falsifying contracts and diverting company funds for at least a year. We've documented over £50,000 missing from the corporate accounts. Carlton's expression was grim. His disappearance is as good as a confession. And yet, Holmes observed, he has taken neither money nor possessions despite apparently careful planning in other respects. A curious approach to flight, wouldn't you agree? The inspector frowned. What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes? Merely that there may be more to this situation than financial malfeasance. Blackwood's correspondence suggests he had discovered something of extraordinary value on this estate, something that might well have made his financial difficulties irrelevant. Treasure hunting, was he? Carlton snorted dismissively. Wouldn't be the first desperate man to chase old legends to avoid facing his creditors. Miss Prescott, who had remained silent during this exchange, rose suddenly. This is absurd. Edward is not a thief or a fugitive. Something has happened to him, something connected to that abominable iron door and the disappearances that preceded his own. Iron door? Carlton's interest was piqued, despite his skepticism. What iron door? Perhaps a demonstration would be more efficient than explanation, Holmes suggested. If you would accompany us to the cellar, Inspector, our strange procession, Holmes, myself, Inspector Carlton, Miss Prescott and Barrett, who had hovered anxiously throughout the conversation, descended once more to the chamber housing the iron door. The inspector examined it with professional thoroughness, paying particular attention to the unusual markings on its surface. Never seen anything like it, he admitted grudgingly. But I fail to see how it connects to Blackwood's disappearance or his financial crimes. Consider this, Inspector, Holmes replied. 3 workmen vanish after attempting to breach this door. Blackwood himself disappears without trace, leaving only his coat and watch in this very spot. These events suggest a pattern that transcends mere coincidence. Ghost stories and superstition, Carlton scoffed. I deal in facts, Mr. Holmes, not local legends, as do I, Inspector, and the facts indicate that someone in this household knows far more than they have revealed. With methodical care, Holmes began examining the chamber once more, scrutinizing every inch of the walls, floor, and ceiling. The answer lies not in the door itself, he murmured, almost to himself, but in what it represents, a misdirection, drawing attention away from the true secret. His examination led him to a section of wall adjacent to the iron door, where he ran his fingers along the ancient stonework. "Observe these marks, Watson," he said quietly, consistent with the regular movement of a concealed mechanism. Before anyone could respond, the sharp report of a pistol echoed through the cellar, the bullet striking the wall inches from Holmes' head. We spun to find Dr. Harrington standing at the entrance to the chamber, a revolver leveled at us, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and determination. "Step away from the wall, Mr. Holmes," he commanded. "I cannot allow you to proceed further." Chapter 6. Behind the Iron Door. "Dr. Harrington," Holmes said calmly, raising his hands in a placating gesture, "I suspect you have misunderstood the situation." The doctor's hand trembled slightly, but the revolver remained fixed upon us. "On the contrary, Mr. Holmes, I understand it perfectly. You've discovered the truth, or enough of it to be dangerous." Inspector Carlton moved to draw his own weapon, but Harrington shook his head sharply. "I wouldn't advise it, Inspector. I am quite prepared to shoot if necessary, though I would prefer to avoid bloodshed." "James, what are you doing?" Miss Prescott's voice was barely above a whisper, her face pale with shock. "Have you gone mad?" "Far from it, Helena. I am merely protecting our family's interests as I have done throughout this affair." He gestured with the revolver. "Everyone into the center of the chamber, if you please. Barrett, secure the entrance. We can't risk interruption." Barrett, to my astonishment, drew a pistol of his own from his coat pocket and moved to the chamber entrance, his formerly nervous demeanor replaced by cold efficiency. "So Barrett is your accomplice," Holmes observed, as we reluctantly complied with Harrington's instructions. "I suspected as much, though I had not determined the exact nature of your arrangement." "My secretary," Harrington corrected, employed to monitor Blackwood after Helena announced their engagement. His theatrical, supernatural encounter proved most effective in reinforcing the narrative of a cursed door. "You arranged the disappearance of the workman as well, I presume?" Holmes continued, his tone conversational despite the gravity of our situation. Harrington snorted. "Simple enough. Men of that class are easily persuaded by coin, and the region offers abundant opportunities for those willing to vanish for a time. The superstitious locals did the rest, transforming mundane absence into mysterious disappearance." "And Blackwood?" I asked, unable to contain myself. "What have you done with him?" A flicker of unease crossed Harrington's features, an unfortunate necessity. He stumbled upon the truth before we were prepared. "You've killed him?" Miss Prescott's voice rose in horror. "No, Helena, he is quite alive, merely contained." Harrington's attention momentarily shifted to his cousin. "I regret the distress this has caused you. Had you confided in me about the manuscript's location instead of sharing it with your fiancé, none of this would have been necessary." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "So Blackwood did find Elias Prescott's hidden repository. He found the entrance, at least." Harrington acknowledged with grudging respect. Centuries of Prescotts searched in vain, yet this industrialist with his renovations and modern engineering knowledge managed to uncover what generations of our family could not. "And what exactly is this repository?" Inspector Carlton demanded, his professional interest clearly piqued, despite our precarious situation. Harrington's lips curved in a thin smile. "The accumulated scientific knowledge of Elias Prescott, a man centuries ahead of his time, metallurgical processes, engineering principles, chemical formulations that even now would revolutionize modern industry. Knowledge worth a fortune to the right buyers. Knowledge that rightfully belongs to both of us. Miss Prescott interjected, her initial shock giving way to indignation. The Prescott legacy is mine as much as yours, James. A legacy you were prepared to share with an outsider, Harrington retorted bitterly. A man who would have exploited it solely for financial gain, with no appreciation for its historical significance. I loved him, she replied simply. During this exchange, I noticed Holmes's gaze systematically surveying the chamber, lingering briefly on certain points of the stonework surrounding the iron door. His expression revealed nothing, but I had known him long enough to recognize when his remarkable brain was working at its highest capacity. A fascinating historical puzzle, Holmes remarked, drawing Harrington's attention back to himself. The iron door that cannot be opened, a deliberate misdirection, I presume. Harrington regarded him warily. What do you mean? It's rather elegant in its simplicity, Holmes continued. An imposing barrier, covered with mystical-seeming symbols, designed to focus attention and effort, while the true entrance remains concealed nearby. The perfect deterrent for medieval minds prone to superstition, and equally effective against modern ones, it seems. A flicker of genuine admiration crossed Harrington's face. You've deduced it correctly, Mr. Holmes. The iron door was never meant to be opened. Its purpose was protective, to divert attention from the actual mechanism, which is located here, Holmes concluded, indicating the section of wall he had been examining before Harrington's interruption. A mechanical lift of remarkable sophistication, disguised as part of the stonework. Enough, Harrington said sharply. Your analytical prowess is impressive, Mr. Holmes, but it changes nothing. Barrett, prepare the passage. We shall relocate our guests to more secure accommodations while we complete our work. Barrett moved toward the wall section Holmes had indicated, but before he could reach it, a deafening crash echoed through the cellar as the main door burst open. Mrs. Crawford stood framed in the entrance, an ancient blunderbuss in her gnarled hands which she discharged with surprising accuracy at Barrett. The secretary crumpled with a cry of pain, his weapon clattering across the stone floor. The momentary distraction was all Inspector Carlton needed. With remarkable swiftness for a man of his solid build, he launched himself at Harrington, knocking the revolver from his hand. The two men grappled briefly before Carlton subdued the doctor with professional efficiency. Well timed, Mrs. Crawford, Holmes remarked calmly, as though the housekeeper's armed intervention were the most natural thing in the world. The old woman sniffed. Knew that one was trouble, she said, indicating Barrett with a jerk of her head. Been watching him skulking about the house at all hours. When I heard the shot, I fetched the master's father's old gun from the gun room and saved us from a most uncomfortable predicament, I added, helping the inspector secure Harrington with his own handcuffs. Blackwood, Miss Prescott said urgently. James said he's alive, contained. We must find him. Holmes was already examining the wall section with renewed focus. The mechanism is here, ingeniously concealed, but the principle is straightforward enough. His fingers found a particular stone, pressing it in a precise sequence with several others. With a grinding of hidden gears, a portion of the wall slid sideways, revealing a small chamber beyond. Within we found Edward Blackwood, bound and gagged, but very much alive. His eyes widened with relief as we entered, and Miss Prescott rushed to his side, helping me remove his restraints. Helena, he gasped when he could speak. Thank God you're safe. When Harrington discovered I had found the manuscripts, all in good time, Mr. Blackwood, Holmes interrupted gently. You've had a trying ordeal, Doctor. Watson will attend to any immediate medical needs while we secure the chamber. Beyond Blackwood's makeshift prison lay a larger room containing an arresting sight shelves lined with ancient manuscripts, diagrams covering the walls, and what appeared to be primitive models of various machines, remarkably preserved. Most striking of all was a large desk upon which rested numerous notebooks filled with elegant script and detailed technical drawings far beyond their apparent age. Elias Prescott's repository, Holmes murmured, surveying the chamber with undisguised fascination. Scientific knowledge, centuries ahead of its time. Inspector Carlton whistled softly. Worth killing for, I suppose. Worth far more preserved for proper scholarly study. Blackwood said, leaning heavily on Miss Prescott's arm as they joined us. That was my intention when I discovered it. Not personal gain, as Harrington believed. He discovered your financial difficulties, Holmes observed, and assumed you would exploit the find to save your business. Blackwood nodded wearily. The embezzlement was Barrett's work, though I had only begun to suspect it. When I found this chamber and understood its significance, I confided in Helena, unaware that Barrett was reporting to Harrington. James was always obsessed with our family history, Miss Prescott added sadly. He must have seen this as his opportunity to restore the Prescott name to prominence at any cost. Later that evening, with Harrington and Barrett in custody, and Blackwood recovering in his chambers, Holmes and I sat before the fire in the library, reflecting on the day's events. The 3 disappearances still trouble me, I admitted. Were the workmen truly just paid to vanish temporarily? 2 were, Holmes replied, puffing thoughtfully on his pipe. The 3rd, I suspect, may have met a more permanent end when he attempted to blackmail Harrington for additional payment. Carlton will investigate more thoroughly, now that he understands the full scope of the affair, and the noises from behind the iron door that so frightened the household. Holmes smiled. A simple acoustic trick. The hidden chamber connects to ancient air shafts that channel sound from the surface. When the wind blows from a particular direction, it creates eerie resonances that seem to emanate from behind the door, another clever element of Elias Prescott's misdirection. Remarkable, I said, to think that a scientific repository of such significance lay hidden for centuries, protected by nothing more than an elaborate deception. The most effective misdirection, Watson, is that which directs attention to one mystery while concealing another. Holmes gazed thoughtfully into the fire. The iron door itself, never meant to be opened, was the perfect riddle, a puzzle without a solution, designed to frustrate and distract while the true secret remained hidden in plain sight. As the firelight played across his austere features, Holmes added, Elias Prescott understood a fundamental truth about human nature. We become so fixated on opening doors that we often fail to consider whether they are meant to be opened at all.